Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for the 5th episode of our Connected Estuary webinar series. My name is Kristen, and I'm the coordinator for Raincoast's Lower Fraser Salmon Conservation Program, and I've been the host of this webinar series. Before we get going, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and am calling in from the town of Squamish, British Columbia, which is the unceded territory of the Squamish Nation and people who have lived here since time immemorial. For those of you who are joining us today, we'd love to get to know you a little bit better. So please feel free to introduce yourselves and let us know where you're watching from in the chat box provided. And throughout the episode, you're welcome to submit any questions you may have for our guests. We will leave about 10 to 15 minutes during the last part of the episode to address them. So if you've been with us throughout this webinar series, we've learned about the importance of the Fraser River Estuary to a lot of different species. And we've also learned that it's one of the largest and most important ecosystems on the Pacific coast of North America. It contains a vast network of tidal channels, marshes, eelgrass meadows, mudflats, and sandflats, which support different fish and wildlife species. So in previous episodes, we've learned about the importance of the estuary to both salmon and southern resident killer whales. Today, we'll build on this knowledge to discuss the importance of the estuary to birds in particular. So together with Boundary Bay, the Fraser River Estuary is the most important overwintering area for waterfowl in Canada, a site of hemispheric significance for migratory shorebirds, and a Ramsar wetland of international importance. So really, it can't be stressed enough how important the Fraser Estuary is for birds on hemispheric and global scale. So for today's episode, we're going to discuss how migratory birds use the Fraser Estuary as a stopover site on the Pacific Flyway, current research and conservation initiatives happening in the estuary, the threats facing the estuary and the birds that rely on it, and finally, what we can do to address these threats. Our two guests today will talk in depth about these topics and their conservation efforts in the estuary that they're leading with Birds Canada. I'm very excited to welcome both James Casey and Amy McDonald from Birds Canada. So James Casey is the Fraser River Estuary Specialist at Birds Canada, and he's joining us now. Hi, James. Great to have you.
Thank you. Looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Our second guest is Amy McDonald, who is the Modus Wildlife Tracking System Coordinator for British Columbia with Birds Canada. Amy is interested in using tracking technologies to support shorebird research and conservation in the Fraser Estuary and more broadly. And here's Amy. Hi, Amy.
Hi, glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us, and thanks to you both for taking the time out of your day to chat with us about the Fraser River Estuary and its importance to birds. So before we get going, I'd like to open up our discussion with just some context-setting questions. So I'm wondering if you both can describe your pathways that you took to the Fraser Estuary. So a little bit about your background and what you're doing now, and then I'll have another follow-up question. But maybe James, we can start with you and hear about your pathway.
Excellent, thanks. I was born and raised in just outside of Terrace in the Skeena watershed in a sub-basin known as the Kitsim-Kalem watersheds. And I worked for a while with the World Wildlife Fund, WWF Canada, on conservation efforts on the North Coast. And was focused on conserving estuaries out of the Prince Rupert area, so at the mouth of the Skeena, from particular developments there that some folks may be aware of around LNG and climate and other stressors up in that region. And then I started working on the concept of environmental flows, which is the timing, quality, and quantity of freshwater flows in the river. And I came down to Vancouver to work on trying to get that concept embedded in what was then the new Water Sustainability Act. So there was a lot of work trying to ensure that the needs of the river were considered in water management decisions. And I mean, to a certain extent, I continue that work in terms of looking at how the connectivity of flows across the Fraser Delta support bird life. And so from working on flows in the Water Act, I've shifted to working on flows and what it means for conserving bird populations.
Great, thank you for that context. Amy, I'm wondering if you could also describe your pathway and your background as well.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm actually kind of new to British Columbia and the Fraser Estuary. I just moved here about a year ago. And I'm originally from the East Coast, from Nova Scotia, and I got my start working with shorebirds out in the East Coast, studying semi-palmated sandpipers in the Bay of Fundy several years ago, and that's a really important stopover site on the Atlantic coast. And from there, I moved to northern Ontario to work at another stopover site up on the coast of James Bay. For several years, I was working up there and did some graduate work on red knots, looking at how important a stopover site it is for them. And now I've moved to the West Coast, to the Pacific Flyway, and am working for Birds Canada, using the Motus wildlife tracking system to study how birds move around the landscape. And we've got a project here in the Fraser Estuary, and I'm also involved in coordinating the expansion of the Motus wildlife tracking system in BC and out west more broadly.
Great. Thank you both for providing those contexts and just giving us an idea of how you arrived and your work now in the estuary. And I just have one more question, and Amy, you kind of touched on it, but I'm just wondering what initially drew you both to working with birds? What initially made you fall in love with them? And then now, what are your favorite birds to observe in the Fraser Estuary? James, you can
jump in, Amy. I
Okay.
got first dibs last time.
Sure. Yeah, so I started working on birds during my undergrad, and I was actually studying invertebrates, but they're intricately connected, and I got to help out with some field work with semi-palmated sandpiper research, and I just loved it so much. I was hooked. And yeah, I think that shorebirds are amazing, how such small birds can migrate thousands of kilometers every year from the Arctic down to the tip of South America and back. And I just love watching the flocks of shorebirds, whether it's in the Bay of Fundy, the Fraser Estuary, or James Bay. It's amazing to watch them swirl around, and yeah, nothing beats the sound of a big flock of shorebirds flying by. The sound of their wings is really incredible.
Mm-hmm,
yeah, so I love watching the western sandpipers and Dunlin out here, and really all of the birds are really exciting to watch.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Such impressive feats that they travel so far. James, how about you?
Yeah, I guess there's a long-winded answer to that could go on for half an hour. I mean, birds are amazing opportunity to be out in nature and just observe and be close to the natural world and learn from it. And so I think that's sort of the longer term hook for me, is that opportunity to engage and sit quietly and marvel at all different types that go by. The initial experience, I was lucky enough to be guided into bird watching through a citizen science project that Birds Canada actually runs. I didn't know it at the time, but it was something called the BC Coastal Waterbird Survey that happens all along the BC coast. And a professor of mine out of Rupert at the Northwest Community College Rito, was taking his classes out to participate in that on a once a month basis. And so I had a chance to go walk the Rupert waterfront and observe what was there, and kind of got hooked in terms of the diversity that went throughout the winter, and the unexpected surprises that you got every once in a while when you had a storm front go through and you got some new birds, and the excitement of the spring arrivals. And so that experience really is what hooked me into it. And then, like I said, it's that ongoing opportunity to step out your door and look to the ground or the air, and there's bird life there, and it's a chance to bring nature into your kind of everyday life. So I think that's the ongoing hook.
Yeah, absolutely. I love hearing people's stories about how they got involved with birds, because they're all so different and unique, and it's always great to hear them. So thanks for providing your backgrounds and the stories. So now I think we could just go into some broader questions about the Fraser Estuary and its importance to birds. And then later on, we'll kind of dive into the details of your respective work. So James, maybe we'll start with you. And I'm wondering if you can describe, so the Fraser River Estuary has numerous habitat types, as we've discussed in previous episodes, which has been more focused on salmon. But I'm wondering if you could describe the habitats that are most important to birds in the estuary.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, really it's the whole delta that's critical to birds. If you wanted to pull up that illustration of the different types of birds there, it's an interconnected matrix. Oh, we can't see it.
Yeah.
Let's try share window. I can try that. Does that work?
Yeah, we see a slideshow. Okay.
So it's really an interconnected matrix of habitats that are required to support this amazing diversity of birds that we see on the Delta. So the Delta supports a couple million birds annually, and a large number of them require the agricultural landscape and coastal wetlands. So things like waterfowl, snow geese, aerial insectivores like barn swallows or tree swallows are all using that agricultural landscape. The shorebirds, which we're going to focus on today, really rely on the mudflats, and the dunlin also jump over that dike and feed in the agricultural landscapes, as do other shorebirds. But that mudflat is a critical piece of the matrix. And then we support a few 100,000 coastal birds of different types. So we have scalps and golden eyes and surf goaters, and all of those require that coastal marine habitat where they're in there feeding either as diving birds on small fish, or as birds focused on bivalves and clams and mussels and that type of thing. So it's that connected web of habitats that are so critical.
Great. Thanks. And Amy, just building off of that, I mean, James kind of touched upon it. So as we mentioned, shorebirds is going to be a big focus, but I'm wondering if there are other groups of birds that we might not think of as much that use the estuary, for example, raptors or other groups of birds that it's also really important for.
Yeah. So yeah, as James mentioned, many species and various different types of birds rely on the Fraser Estuary and are here in a variety of seasons. Yeah, shorebirds are a big one, of course. A huge proportion of the western sandpiper population uses the Delta as a stopover site, and large numbers of dunlin migrate through, but also spend the winter here. In terms of other birds, a huge number of waterfowl spend the winter here. Lots of different types of ducks, from American widgeons and green-winged teals to some of the sea ducks like scoters. Also geese like snow geese and brant are here as well. In terms of some other species, there are raptors that forage in the coastal marshes, and the barn owl is a species at risk here in the Fraser Delta, and there's also a particular subspecies of great blue heron here in the Delta as well. And as James mentioned briefly, the agricultural habitats are important for aerial insectivores like barn swallows and other swallows like tree swallows. And aerial insectivores as a group are really declining across North America. We've seen very large declines in aerial insectivores. So they're definitely are species or in a group of conservation concern.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. Thanks to you both for setting the stage there. And Now I think it'd be useful for our participants to get a sense of the,
Yeah, we have a test alert.
oh,
It successfully worked, but I have to turn it off.
yeah.
Okay, clear. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay, but I think we all got it. So we kind of talked about the Fraser Estuary, but I'm wondering if we can talk about the Pacific Flyway. So James, I'm wondering, what is a flyway, and if you could describe the Pacific Flyway as well as the Fraser Estuary as a stopover site.
Yeah, excellent question. Can you pull up again the next slide here? So, oh, for some reason that's not coming through quite as we'd like. But so in general, flyways are large geographic routes that birds tend to follow as they migrate north or south to north, north to south, depending on the direction they're headed. And they are defined by geo-environmental attributes that provide food sources for these birds, and also high-level wind corridors as they migrate along certain routes. And so the Pacific Flyway is a broad corridor that runs along the Pacific coast of Central, South, and North America. And birds will move north to south along this route to engage in kind of the life history cycle of breeding in certain more northerly latitudes, and then migrating to more southerly latitude to overwinter, and then headed back again in the next year to repeat that cycle. And so the Fraser Estuary sits at one of these really productive sites that can serve both as a stopover site. So for birds such as shorebirds that are making this long distance migration, they stop over here briefly. So a western sandpiper is here for, let's say, probably less than a week, more like 3 days, but let's say 3 days to 7 days or something before moving on to their next location. Whereas a bird such as the snow geese or the subpopulation of dunlin that overwinter here in the delta, so this would be the northerly-most estuary that's kind of ice-free and can support large abundances of birds. And so we have these overwintering population that spends time here before, again, heading north to breed. And then we also have overwintering behavior of some of the raptors that Amy touched on, in terms of like the bald eagles that we see in the winter here are here in the hundreds. And then as the snow melts up in the headwaters, these eagles move their way up into the interior of the province in these short distance migrations, eat the salmon that are eventually spawning in the rivers, the headwaters, and then as those rivers freeze up again, come back to the delta, where they're able to feed on the aggregations of waterfowl and other birds that are occurring here in the delta. We see some similar behavior on the coast in terms of the sculps aggregating, or the harlequin ducks aggregating the golden eyes in these large rafts here on the delta and then moving up the coast. So we have a stopover role, we have a overwintering role, and then we also have a breeding role. So we have populations that are coming up to this region to breed. And so right now we have like a lot of Annas and rufous hummingbirds. And so we have rufous hummingbirds coming up from Mexico to overwinter here to breed here in the delta. And so these birds are taking this migratory route both because they're able to feed as they go along. So the rufous hummingbird is relying on those early spring flowers that are coming out to power their migration, or the dunlin are relying on certain biofilm production in the delta to power that migration as they go along.
Great. Thanks for mentioning biofilm, and I think we'll probably circle back to it later just because it does play such a key role, but thanks for describing the Pacific Flyway. And I'm wondering if it'd be worth showing the dunlin and snow geese videos just to show people what, the groups of those birds look like.
Yeah, go for it. I mean, I think they're kind of unique spectacles on the delta.
Yeah, definitely. Okay.
the raptor species that we're seeing recover is Peregrine Falcons, and so they use this over the water murmuration behavior to avoid predation from the falcons.
Yeah, it's so, and Amy was touching upon that earlier, how it's just like a beautiful thing to watch and so fascinating. I'll just pop the snow geese video up as well, just because I think it shows another good video of some birds in the estuary.
On the ground, but they don't use that murmuration. This is just a really large flock of geese that are coming to the delta to feed. And so both the productivity of the marsh habitat on the delta is critical to these geese, and then also the stewardship practices from the farmers on the delta are critical. So we get farmers that are planting winter cover crop and leaving certain fields fallow for a year or two to support these bird populations, which is a really appreciated effort from the farmers to support these large abundances of waterfowl.
Great, thanks. Amy, I think we'll hop over to you now, and I'm wondering if you can describe, and you did touch upon it a little bit earlier with aerial insectivores, how we're seeing these big declines, but I'm wondering if you could talk about how are shorebirds doing in terms of population growth or decline in British Columbia, and then I'm wondering if the health of the Fraser Estuary itself can have an effect on that growth or decline of shorebird populations.
Yeah. Broadly in North America, shorebirds are declining. So like the aerial insectivores, over the last 50 years, we have seen substantial declines in shorebirds as a whole. I actually have a little image there. Kristen, yeah, there we go. So what you can see from this is from the State of Canada's Birds Report from couple of years ago, and overall since 1970, shorebirds have declined by about 40%. And that's particularly pronounced for long distance migrant shorebirds, many of which breed in the Arctic. So these are birds that are flying thousands of kilometers every year and relying on a few key stopover sites along the way where they can rest and then refuel, feed voraciously on invertebrates, biofilm, to build up the fat reserves that they need to complete their migrations. So stopover sites like the Fraser Delta are extremely important for migrating shorebirds because they need suitable habitat, good quality prey base where they can feed up and build up those fat reserves that they need to fuel their next leg of their migration. And shorebirds are pretty amazing in how they can power these long distance flights. Some species will stop in an area for as little as 2 weeks and they'll feed voraciously and double their weight, just packing on fat to fuel the next leg of their journey. And then they'll fly thousands of kilometers in a multi-day nonstop flight. So these sorts of habitats that provide those resources for them where they can refuel are really essential.
Great. Thank you for providing that information. Yeah, so, and again, we'll kind of come back into the foraging and biofilm and the importance of that intensive feeding that you mentioned a little bit later. But now I'm wondering if we can dive a little bit more into some of the work that you both are doing now. So James, as part of your work with Birds Canada, you're working on establishing the Fraser Delta and Estuary as a key biodiversity area. So I'm wondering if you could describe what a key biodiversity area is, and then we'll provide some more details.
Right. So, I mean, a key biodiversity area is basically acknowledgement of the existing biodiversity values that are in place. So, in a global context, there are places that support globally significant abundances of species in large aggregations, or there are places that support very rare and unique species. And so a key biodiversity area is a way of identifying where those occurrences happen and acknowledging that to the world. that there's no necessarily policy designation. It's more a sharing of factual findings of abundance or rarity of these species. And so there is a program called the KBA Canada program that is mapping out KBAs across the country. And in fact, this is happening around the globe through various conservation organizations. And the Fraser is one of those sites that we know will become a KBA or is a KBA because of its abundance of bird species, and then also the rarity of a couple of endangered or at-risk species that happen on the delta.
Great. And so, and you just briefly touched upon it, that a KBA doesn't necessarily have any policy implications, but I'm wondering if there would be any benefits in terms of protection of establishing the Fraser Estuary as a KBA, or like, for example, could it deter development from happening, or is it really just that acknowledgement of an important area in terms of biodiversity?
So it is really that acknowledgement of the area is important, and then it's up to decision makers about what they want to do with that knowledge. So it's an agreement amongst the experts that the site is uniquely important. And if you put that in front of a decision maker, they need to make the choice about what will they do to maintain a site that's globally important. And so part of it can inform the vision that people make about how a region should be used. So currently, our Canadian government vision for the Fraser Delta is as a gateway to Asia, so a trade and development vision. Perhaps as they learn about the unique values here on the Delta, their vision may shift to encompass and promote those values. Similarly, if you're an investment firm or a banker or a private company wanting to operate on the Delta, as you learn about how uniquely important this place is, hopefully you will make decisions about your practices and your activities that respect that unique value. Great.
Thanks for providing that context. Amy, we'll come back to you now, and I'm just wondering if you can describe your work in more detail using the MODIS wildlife tracking system on Dunlins in the Delta and Estuary. And so what is the goal of this system, and how does it work?
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start maybe by just explaining what the MODIS wildlife tracking system is. So MODIS is a collaborative research network that uses radio telemetry to track birds, bats, and even a few large insects to study their ecology and conservation, and to promote education about bird migration and movements, and how we can best protect them. So maybe this would be a good spot to show the MODIS introductory video.
For sure. Yeah, I'll pop it up now.
Birds have the power to touch our hearts with their beauty and songs, to surprise and fascinate us with their behavior, to inspire us with amazing feats of strength and endurance. Some songbirds migrate thousands of kilometers every year in challenging conditions. Birds play critical roles in our ecosystems. They pollinate plants and spread seeds. They help control insects. Birds are also valuable indicators of change. Many populations have been seriously declining for decades. 1/3 of North American bird species need urgent conservation action to avoid extinction. We have to act now to protect the habitats and systems that support all life on Earth. But how? Scientists must unlock the mysteries of migratory birds and study their movements on breeding grounds, along migration routes, and in wintering areas. The MODIS wildlife tracking system uses tiny tracking devices and a network of hundreds of receiving stations strategically located throughout the Western Hemisphere. MODIS is yielding spectacular discoveries. Now, researchers can safely track bird movements over vast distances and with incredible detail to pinpoint the greatest threats to vulnerable species. The results help us identify conservation priorities and direct efforts and funds for maximum impact. Get involved today. You can help us conserve bird populations and habitats to ensure healthier environments for wildlife and for people. We have the power to make a big difference with your support.
Yeah, so essentially, that's kind of a very brief overview of Modus, but the key that really makes Modus work the way it does is that it's collaborative. So all of the tags that are deployed on birds or bats operate at the same frequency, but they still have a unique ID encoded in them. So then all of the receiver stations throughout the Western Hemisphere, and even now moving into Europe and Australia as well, can pick up any of those birds. So what makes Modus tick is that any birds that are tagged in the system can be picked up by any receiver in the system, which really expands the scale and the scope of everyone's work and maximizes the use of limited funding that's available. So these tags that get detected by the receivers, then all the data is housed in a centralized database that Birds Canada maintains, so that folks have access to the data of birds that they may have tagged that are picked up on receivers that not only are maintained by them, but are also maintained by anyone else working using Modus. So I'll show another image maybe here. Yeah, so this is, I took this screenshot yesterday from the Modus website, but each of these yellow dots is a receiver station. So it's expanding all the time. Most of the receiver stations are in Eastern North America, where the network started, but it's growing and growing out here on the West Coast as well. And there are quite a few stations in South America now too, to capture really hemispheric scale movements of birds. So the project that Birds Canada is working on in the Fraser Estuary is to track the movements of dunlin using Modus. And so dunlin not only migrate through the Fraser Estuary and use it as a stopover site, but large numbers of dunlin also spend the winter here. So we're particularly interested in how dunlin are moving around the Fraser Estuary throughout the overwintering period. So are birds that are tagged in Boundary Bay, do they largely stay within Boundary Bay, or do they move back and forth between Boundary Bay and Roberts and Sturgeon Banks? And so that's what we're interested in using Modus to study. We can also get some extra information about departure timing as well, depending on if the birds keep their tags long enough to monitor when they leave the Fraser Estuary to migrate north towards the Arctic as well.
Great. So when you're out there, I'm wondering if you can just walk us through a day in the field, if you're catching dunlins and putting the little transceivers on them, if I think it'd just be great to walk us through that experience. Yeah, for sure. So yeah, a typical day in the field is actually a night in the field. So shorebirds have really sharp vision. So it actually is easier to capture birds at night than it is during the day, because they have such good eyesight. They'll see the nets and just avoid them, especially when you're trying to catch them on really big, vast, open mudflats. I have a couple of pictures here that I can show. So yeah, we're working at night to set up nets out on the mudflats, and then capture
capture dunlin, as soon as we have someone always monitoring the net. So as soon as a dunlin lands in the net, we're there to take it out immediately so that they're handled for the least amount of time possible to reduce stress to the birds. And we take a number of kind of standard measurements of wing length, bill length, and how much fat they're storing on their body. And then we also equip them with a little radio transmitter. So that's in the photo on the left, where you can see a little transmitter here, and then the antenna just extends out down the back and out over the tail. So these transmitters are really light. They're just under a gram. So they're less than 2% of the body weight of the bird, so that they're not carrying too much extra weight. And we also attach them with glue so that once the battery expires, the birds will molt the tags off, and so they're not stuck carrying extra weight for after that tag has stopped working. And we also put out little alphanumeric leg flags, and this is quite a few species of shorebirds have been studied using these leg flags. You can get individual birds without having to recapture them. So again, that's aimed at reducing stress to the birds so that they can be identified without needing to actually handle them again. And then by looking at patterns and resightings over the years, you can estimate things like survival rates. So that's and get more information about where the birds are traveling.
Great. Awesome. Thanks, Amy. So I'm just keeping an eye on our time here, and I'm wondering, just quickly, Amy, and you talked on it a little bit earlier, and then we'll hop back over to James to talk about biofilm. But I'm wondering, with this work, capturing the dunlins and putting transceivers on them, what is the ultimate goal of your project with Birds Canada? What is this data hoping to inform?
Yeah, like I mentioned, we want to look at how birds are moving around the Fraser Estuary, and this will help us understand the what sites they're relying on and the connectivity between different areas within the Fraser Estuary. So if birds that are tagged in Boundary Bay are really staying largely in the same area throughout the overwintering period, that's a really critical spot to them, and the loss of habitat impact those birds that are relying on that space. Likewise, if they're moving around a lot between different areas of the estuary, that demonstrates how connected these different habitats are, and demonstrates the importance of having a network of protected areas and habitat throughout the Fraser Estuary that the birds can continue to rely on to fuel their migration, and also as overwintering habitat. And it might also help us identify any areas that dunlin are using that are particularly vulnerable, and so that would help us understand the importance of those sites.
Mm-hmm. Great. James, we'll go over to you now. I'm wondering, so earlier in the hour we talked about the role that the estuary plays as a stopover site in the Pacific Flyway, and that it's really important for foraging opportunities for shorebirds. So I'm wondering if you could describe, biofilm, which is what they're primarily foraging for. What is biofilm, and why it's so important to these birds?
Okay, sure. If you want to just pull up the image there, that's hopefully is showing a photo of a western sandpiper at Brunswick Point engaged in this foraging for biofilm. And biofilm is basically a very, very thin mucousy layer of slime on top of the mud. It's really difficult to get a nice photo of. I've not seen anybody succeed yet, but they use their specially adapted tongues that we're seeing here, and they slap that down on this slime, and it acts like Velcro and allows them to pull that slime into their mouth, and that's their main food source for westerns at on the delta is this biofilm substance. Dunlin are a little bit more diverse in terms of their food sources, so they're also feeding on invertebrates and a little bit on the biofilm, and then also a certain marine worm species. At other locations, western sandpipers also feed on invertebrates and other crustaceans within the mud flats. But here at the delta, they're really focused on this biofilm material. And for a while, we didn't know exactly why, until there was some research led out of Environment and Climate Change Canada that has identified that they're targeting the biofilm for the fatty acids that are the essential fatty acids that are within the biofilm. And so biofilm, when triggered by salinity and temperature and elevation on the mud flats, produce higher levels of polyunsaturated long chain fatty acid. We'll just call them PUFAs for short, which are essential to their metabolism and being able to power their long-term or their long-distance migration. And so that's really what biofilm is that thin layer of slime made up of diatoms. And the reason it's so important is those fatty acids that are produced in elevated levels during the spring freshet, which it just happens to be when the Dunlin are passing, or the westerns are passing through.
Great. And I just popped Amy's screen up here, which I think shows maybe some microscopic photos of biofilm. Is that right, Amy?
Yeah, that's under an scanning electron microscope. So really zoomed in. That's the tongues of western sandpiper, the tip of the tongue.
So that's not the biofilm, that's the tongue of the bird itself that they're zooming in on. If you look at photo D, you can kind of see some of that slime right at the water's edge there, but it is a microscopic, very thin layer that we don't have good photos of.
Gotcha. Great. Yeah, just seeing the photos of the tongue is so interesting.
Yeah, they're really kind of fun looking and good for scooping that stuff up.
Yeah, great. So now just in our last 15 minutes or so, and I just want to provide a quick reminder to our participants that if you do have questions for either James or Amy, feel free to submit them in the comments box and we'll get to them in about 10 minutes or so. So we kind of have described the importance of the estuary, its different habitat types to different groups of birds, in particular shorebirds, and its position in the Pacific Flyway. And so I'm just wondering if you both could describe from your perspective, what are the current threats facing the Fraser Delta and estuary, and what this means for birds. And so maybe Amy, we can start with you, and then James, you can follow.
Sure. So I think some of the threats that are facing shorebirds in the Fraser Estuary are habitat loss is a really big one. And that's the case for shorebirds around the globe, really. And I think it applies here too, because shorebirds migrate such long distances and rely on these few key stopover sites to complete those migrations. The loss of even small areas of critical habitat can really have population level impacts, because shorebirds are particularly vulnerable in that way, because such large numbers congregate in these relatively small geographic areas in terms of the scale of their migration. Losing one of those sites could be really detrimental. So you can kind of think of some of these long distance migrants like they're climbing this giant hemispheric ladder, and if you take out too many rungs on that ladder, they're not going to be able to climb it in the same way anymore. So protecting these sites, I think, is really important, as well as making sure that the food sources that they rely on at these sites are still available there for them.
Definitely. That ladder analogy is really helpful. Thanks for that. James, and I'm wondering now from your perspective what some of the threats are.
Yeah, I mean, definitely habitat loss is number one on the list. And there's a couple of activities that are happening on the Delta that are behind that habitat loss that are worth being aware of. The development of shipping infrastructure on the Delta is a main source of habitat loss. So proposed projects like the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 will have population impacts on western sandpipers. One of the mechanisms that happens is both its physical footprint, but also then the way it changes the flow of water across the delta. So that freshwater connectivity that Raincoast is working on, it's so important for shorebirds as well as other species. And another main threat facing them is sea level rise and this issue of climate-driven sea level rise resulting in coastal squeeze. And so as we adapt as a community to sea level rise, simply raising the dikes isn't really a sustainable option if we want to maintain the biodiversity that the delta supports. And so you heard about this with Eric and Deborah. It's the last session, and it plays out in relevant to these shorebird populations that if we don't maintain the mudflats and we don't raise the elevation of those mudflats as would naturally occur, then we're not going to have those mudflats that support the shorebirds. And so we need to find a way to increase the elevation of those mudflats as currently in place, or identify alternative locations for mudflats, maybe further inland or in other parts of the delta.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for making that connection. It's so interesting to hear about how, projects that are proposed for increasing the elevation of the salt marsh relate to birds and their health. So it's such an interconnected system, and it's really great to tie all those aspects together. Mm-hmm. So now that we've outlined some of these threats, what are some steps that we can take to address these threats? And maybe Amy, we can go back to you or James.
I mean, so I'd say one of the big steps that we need to take is we project the proposed Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project. We'll put a link up that's a letter to contact your MP and call for the rejection of that project. But I think that's a critical step for those that are concerned about the delta is stop walking down this path of industrialization of the delta that we're currently on. And if we stop walking that path, then start looking at alternatives. And so this is where I think the Fraser Estuary Management Plan has an important role in terms of what is the vision that we have for the delta and what kind of practices are applicable on the delta. And as we define that vision, protecting areas like Brunswick Point using stronger federal protections is a critical step. Brunswick Point, Iona mudflats, and Mud Bay, Brown Debray area are some of these key globally significant habitats that need stronger protection.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks, James. And Amy, over to you.
Yeah, I definitely agree with everything James is saying. Ensuring that the habitat remains intact is really critical, and it's been recognized as important shorebird habitat of hemispheric importance by the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network, but kind of like the KBA designation that raises awareness and raises the profile of the site, but it doesn't actually afford any legal protections. So I think increasing those protections for these really key areas is really important.
Absolutely. And just quickly before we get to the questions, community science is often such an important role in your work, and I'm wondering if you both could describe the role that citizen science plays in Birds Canada work, and as well as some opportunities. I think there are some opportunities, and we have the links available to provide for people to get involved in either Birds Canada work or some other exciting programs and initiatives like Vancouver Bird Week. So I'm wondering if each of you could describe how community-based science is incorporated into your work, and then we'll talk about opportunities.
Go ahead, Amy.
Okay, I can. I'll touch on MODIS particularly and specifically, and like I said, MODIS is super collaborative, and that's what makes it work. So we partner with many different groups and people to host MODIS stations, whether they're on public buildings, in parks, with private landowners. And one kind of interesting or neat thing that's a possibility for MODIS is the educational opportunities. So there are a number of MODIS stations on schools, and there's some education outreach materials that are curriculum linked for students to learn about bird migration. So I think that's a really valuable opportunity is partnering with schools for MODIS, and I'm actually helping set up a MODIS station at a school in Richmond this Friday. So that'll be a new one on the map.
Great. We actually had a comment in from Michael Wolf, who said he's in his classroom waiting for his Biology 11 students to arrive here in Richmond, BC. So maybe it's at the same school, but at least we have some students tuning in today. So that's really exciting.
Excellent. Yeah, so I mean, birds are an amazing opportunity for citizen science. A lot of what we know about birds comes from citizen science, people just getting into bird watching and then reporting on what they see. There's a platform called eBird where a lot of birders, as they develop their expertise, start reporting what they're seeing out there. And those citizen science reports, in combination with more event-specific type of activities. So a lot of people participate in the Christmas bird count. In the Fraser Delta, every November, we do a Fraser Delta count for birds. We have more structured programs like the Coastal Water Bird Survey, if you just like to focus on coastal birds. And we also monitor owls through a nocturnal owl survey that volunteers can participate in, or even beach dead birds to help us identify what the source of mortality for birds are. And so there's a lot of ways citizens can participate in gathering that data. And then through the support of Environment and Climate Change Canada, Birds Canada has this centralized database that allows us to bring all of that information together and help us understand where birds are occurring in large abundances and what the overall population trends of these birds are. And that allows us then to identify those areas to prioritize conservation action. So yeah, definitely a lot of work in terms of monitoring birds. And then there's also a lot of work in terms of helping birds. So a lot of people put out bird nests or make bird-friendly backyards. So there's a link there if you want to make your backyard more appealing and support those migratory birds. Visit that site, and it has some tips on creating a bird garden and also making sure that your bird backyard is bird friendly.
Great. Thanks for that. So we'll just spend a couple more minutes wrapping up my question for you, and then we'll move on to participant questions. But I'm just wondering in a few sentences what you could say the next steps for your work are. And Amy, we can start with you.
Sure. So the next steps for our Dunlin research in particular are that last year was our first year of the project. So this year we're looking at putting out some more tags on Dunlin to collect more data. So we'll be putting out some more tags this fall on Dunlin. And getting another year of overwintering movements around the Delta. And we also just put out just a few tags as a little pilot project to look at whether we can capture those departures in the spring and see when birds are leaving the Fraser Estuary and what pathways they're following as they migrate north, since there are recently a number of new MODIS stations going up the east side of Vancouver Island, and even a few further north than that Environment and Climate Change Canada has set up and collaborated with others to set up as well. So that's really interesting. And as I mentioned, we're setting up a new MODIS station on Friday, and there are a couple more that I'm working on as well. Great.
Exciting. Next steps. Lots of work happening. James, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, the Roberts Bank Terminal 2 project remains a really bad idea as currently designed. And so I'll continue to engage expressing concerns about that project. The next information package is coming out soon. So we'll be reviewing that to see whether they've actually redesigned the project in a way that is sustainable for birds. And then engaging also in a call for the Fraser Estuary management planning process. We need to get that reestablished and more democratic and engagement of Indigenous and communities in that planning process. And the nature-based solutions actions that are coming in terms of softer approaches to climate adaptation and climate mitigation have huge potentials for benefiting both the climate objective, but then also the bird and biodiversity objectives. So looking for projects to support that nature-based adaptation and mitigation activities in the Delta and how they fit into a vision for the estuary.
Great. Thanks so much. So we've got a couple of questions, and we have Laura Matheson who asked, does biofilm have a color? So either one of you who would like to answer, go for it.
Yeah, so when I've been out on the Delta, it has had kind of a greenish brown tinge to it. It's not like a bright green, like a kelp or a sea lettuce or something like that, but there are, like I said, diatoms in it that do produce chlorophyll, so you do get a kind of a greenish tinge, but it wouldn't be super vibrant.
Great. And we have a question from Sophie Wilson who asks, will the Massey Tunnel replacement affect shorebirds? And Amy, would you like to go for that one?
Yeah, I'll admit I don't know a ton about the project, so this I have a lot to learn there. But I think that certainly barriers to movement can be an issue. Like shorebirds are, and certainly the disturbance, I think, aspect of maybe the ongoing, that would be a concern, because shorebirds are using stopover sites to build up the fat reserves. They also need to not be burning energy too much while they're at the stopover site. So things like disturbance that causes them to fly up and spend a lot of time flocking out over the water rather than roosting on shore or feeding on the mudflats can make it harder for them to build up those fat reserves that they need.
So if I could, one of the other really interesting things that we're learning about biofilm and the productivity of fatty acids is that it's linked to freshwater discharge. And so it's not a question that's actually been looked at as far as I know. Will the Massey Tunnel alter the flow of water through that lower part of the Delta? But if it does, then that has the potential to impact the productivity of deltas. And so this is one of the pieces where that science is just emerging around that connection between the timing and quantity of freshwater flows on the mud banks and what's happening further up the river. So a short answer is we don't know if the Massey Tunnel will impact shorebirds. The mechanism by which it could is a changing in flow, but I've not seen any research on that changing of flow related to the Massey Tunnel.
Great. Thanks for that, James. So we've just got about a minute left, and I have so many more questions for you both, but we won't be able to get to them all today. So I just want to give a big thanks to both James and Amy for providing their time today to share their knowledge about birds and the importance of the estuary, the Delta and the estuary to birds. We really appreciate it. So just a quick notification, our next episode for Connected Estuary will be 2 weeks from now on Wednesday, May 26th, again at 12 p.m. Pacific time. And our final episode of the webinar series will discuss bold collaborative conservation initiatives that are taking place and that are planned to recover the ecological resilience of the Fraser River estuary for the future. And so we look forward to seeing you all there. And thanks again for joining us. And thanks, James and Amy, for taking the time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks. Bye.